Good evening and welcome to Uncivil Disobedience. We're glad you're still sticking around. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me, as always, is my co-host and partner in crime and significantly better looking other half, Kennedy Cooper.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
And also our guest tonight, Comrade Curls, as you know if you follow him on Twitter, RJ from the Fred Hampton Left. Thanks for joining us, RJ.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you. I've never been introduced by my Twitter name, but if you see the curls here, you know it's me. So
we're just Twitter obsessed here at Uncivil Disobedience.
Yeah, one of my friends told me that he likes being nicknamed terminally online.
See, I just, my handle is my name, so that's really easy. It doesn't cause any weird nickname things. I do, though, often go by the handle Themperor Kennedy, and that's become like a bit of a thing. Even if I take that away, people will still refer to me that way. So then I feel like obligated to just like put it back when I'm like done with whatever my bit is, you know?
Well, you are definitely the Themperor. I mean, that can't be denied.
Yeah, that's true. Usually a lot of people go by their Twitter names. Like some of my favorite ones I see is like Thea Ballerina, Biden's hairy leg, Communist Sailor Moon. Like those are some of my favorite Twitter account names. Like before I got like S-worded, my old account name was like, what was it? I can't think of it right now, but my current one is like RJ has like shit-lived derangement syndrome.
Yes.
Oh, I love it.
Oh, that's really good.
Mine's changed a little bit every now and then. I keep playing around with the hashtags and such.
I always like it when we bring people on any show that I'm on and they want to be introduced by their really bizarre Twitter name. Like, I love those people, because like, especially Sentai Truther Club, we get the most of those, I think, on that show. But we'll get, these guests and we'll be like, what do you want us to call you? And they're like, oh, yeah, just call me Lennon's Stanky Armpit or whatever,
No, I totally get why she does it, because she's both a legitimate lawyer and kind of a hacktivist. Madam Robin Hood will actually be Madam Robin Hood on an national organizing call for a nonprofit. But that's because she does the hacktivist thing and the legitimate lawyer thing, and she doesn't want them to mix up, and she prefers to use the hacktivist persona for anything online media related or political, just to be safe from her legitimate lawyer job.
Yeah, makes sense.
Makes total sense to me. If I were a lawyer, obviously I'm not. If I were a lawyer, I would keep things separate.
I am also obviously not a lawyer. And I don't know that I could keep things separate. I'm not good at that sort of thing. So that's another strike against me being a lawyer.
Seems like being a lawyer is kind of hard, though, don't you think? I mean,
it is.
Makes a lot of money, though.
Well, depends. It depends.
Potentially.
It makes a lot more money for people working for corporations than for people working as, say, public defenders.
True.
And
yes.
If you think about it, one of the reasons that our education system is so expensive is to force lawyers to take more morally compromising jobs that they might not take if they weren't in debt.
No, I have a lawyer friend that talks about this, and he and I, although we may occasionally, I don't know if he's watching this by chance, we may occasionally disagree on some political matters. We do agree on most things. And I also know him to be a stand-up guy who is trying to do the best things that he can with that law degree in general. And he talks all the time about how it's this impossible struggle of like, he wants to take these cases, that are to help people, but he's also got to take some that make money, and he's got to like figure out how to balance his time and stuff. But, you can't possibly, even if all you wanted to do was like defend the little guy all day, you just can't, because there's actually no money in that.
It's true. Unless you're rich. Rich people can take those jobs. And that lets rich people then appear to be people of the people because they have these low-paid public defender jobs. But they don't say they're rich. And then when they go into politics and get elected, you find out they're rich.
True. They're the poorest among the rich.
The poorest among the rich. Also remember that when politicians say middle class, I said this last week, but I can't say it enough. Politicians mean the poorest of the rich, not the richest of the poor.
Right. Yeah.
The people who think of themselves as middle class are the richest of the poor.
That's true.
Because being middle class requires a debt load that means you don't actually own your own capital. The bank owns it. Whether it's your education, which you'll be paying on for life for a lot of people, or whether it's your house, which you'll be paying on for at least 20 years for most people. The bank owns your wealth if you're the poorest of the rich. That's not middle class to politicians.
Speaking of like a middle class, did you hear what happened with this situation that's going on right now with BlackRock, in which BlackRock is buying up a lot of the middle class housing that you would have? And so how most middle class Americans and working class Americans generate wealth is through their homes.
Mm-hmm.
So by paying the mortgage, really investing in it is really how much they make their money. That when they sell it and get a new home, they make 30K, 40K profit based on that home. But if you look what happened with BlackRock right now, since they're buying up all these homes, they're creating a permanent renters middle class.
Yes.
Right? And so all the equity you would get on your homes is basically zero for the average working class person.
True.
Well, at the same time, you're kind of BlackRock is doing the banks a favor, because if the banks aren't holding up all that risk, then the next time the bubble breaks, which in capitalism is every 4 to 7 years, now instead of the banks taking all of that blame, and then when they have to go to Congress and get all this money, it's kind of spread evenly throughout the rest of corporate America. So at the same time, it looks like the top is consolidated and they know what they're doing, and we should just cede power to them because they know what's going on, right? No. So it's going to end up creating more problems. So instead of having a centralized power structure that we can all fight against when they fuck us over, now it's more spread about evenly, which makes it more difficult to really fight against. That's just what I got to say about that.
No, I kind of have to agree with that. I also have to say, and this is something that everybody who gets too much in their own whiteness should think about now, because you're about to experience something that you didn't care about when it happened to other people. A whole lot of the white middle class is going to get the exact same experience, maybe a little more polite, maybe with fewer cops, because we know how it is. They like to go easier on white people. But with maybe a little less physical violence, the white middle class is going to have the experience that the black middle class had during the Obama recovery. You're going to see a lot of wealth looted from white homeowners now because they couldn't pay their mortgages. You're going to see it harder for those people to recover. That crash and the recovery after wiped out black wealth for a generation. We're now going to see middle class wealth across the rest of the board wiped out for a generation too, or pretty close to it. Which means literally everyone who isn't rich is going to be poor. Now
yeah, it's terrifying. Also, I just want to say we're getting lots of great comments, including from some people I love on Twitter. I can't put the comments up, but Chris, if you want to throw some up. Yeah, it's terrifying because like I just like turned 30 over the pandemic. I'm now 31 just recently. And I'm like looking at, okay, I want to get some home ownership at some point myself, maybe. Like I'm getting old enough that I would really like that to happen at some point, maybe. And now
Okay.
we're in this.
Sorry to interrupt.
We're just in this situation that's terrifying. With that, like, it's just like I feel like everybody that I know that's around my age that was thinking maybe we're gonna do it 10 years later than our parents or 20 years later than our parents, but we will eventually own homes. Now me and a lot of my friends are like, fuck, is that gonna happen at all? Like, is that even a possibility? Because like we all thought maybe if we scraped hard enough, and like, I mean, everybody who knows me know I know that I come from very little. A lot of my friends do too. Like, we all thought though, if we scraped hard enough, maybe. And now it's just like, I don't know. The housing market's out of control. You look at what BlackRock's doing. It's completely, it's destroying the housing market in a way that's kind of unprecedented.
Here's where it's going to be. If you and 9 of your other friends can get together and pool credit to all co-sign together for a loan and all put money together for a down payment, then you and 9 of your friends might be able to afford a 1-bedroom.
Yeah.
Now, I'm exaggerating.
I know. No, you're not, because here's the thing. Already, before any of this, I was thinking probably, my most likely option for home ownership would be like a housing co-op with people. Like not like just owning a home by myself. I can't afford that. I couldn't afford that before this. Now I'm like, yeah, you're not exaggerating at all. The real estate market is just completely devastated right now because of this shit. And it's just like, it's depressing for a lot of people. I see people all around me just like losing hope inside of this. When you watch a regular ass shitty house in your like neighborhood that isn't even like the best neighborhood in town, isn't even close to your job or close to the good schools or whatever. Like when you watch a house like that shoot up to like $250,000, that's just depressing.
So
I think
if those are New Mexico prices, I can only tell you it gets more depressing in Oregon, and you don't want to even visit New York or Los Angeles.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as a funnel versus a suction. And what I mean by that is 2008, when you had a lot of Black working class people, they put a lot of their equity in their homes. And in 2008, it was really a funnel upwards, kicking them out of their homes through the foreclosure, funneling that money to the banks. And the banks would literally buy it up cheap as hell, and they would make so much profit off of it. This time around with BlackRock and these different private corporations, it's more of a suction effect. So now you're taking money that, some of those in the middle class, white working class, sometimes Black liberals, Black bourgeoisie, white blue bourgeoisie, any excess money they have that they've benefited from because of the pandemic, because there are some people in certain economic brackets that have benefited during COVID. Now these BlackRock companies have realized they're searching for homes. That's where the housing market is going back up, mostly because of BlackRock and these other corporations buying up all the used homes. So now these new people coming in, they want to buy homes that don't exist. So you have to build homes. That's why lumber is like $200. Like, it's freaking ridiculous. So it's like a suction cup effect of BlackRock, the big banks, all colluding together to take obscene amount of wealth. And you're basically paying people to live there, and you're not benefiting from it. That's what renting is.
Yep.
And so that's the biggest problem that we see in the future, is when now you have not only the Black working class, but the white working class becoming, not even getting to the middle class model. They've been coming after the middle class too, which we see. So it's just now they're trying to create a state of rich and poor, because regardless of you being a leftist, how you feel about the housing market, it's one of the last things in the capitalistic system that benefits working class people easily. So
right.
If and I have to put this out there, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of these comments, but if you're white, or if you already have money, owning a house benefits you. One of the things, because banks and people will always want to blame individuals and not institutions. but banking and real estate are white supremacist institutions that are built around keeping Black people in their physical place in the country and their figurative place in society, both at the same time. And they do that by selling Black people homes in Black neighborhoods and charging them too much interest and foreclosing much quicker than they foreclose on white people. Mm-hmm. All that was true before 2008. And that's why 2008 hit Black homeowners so much worse. I just wanted to not forget to bring that up.
No, it's really fair.
Yeah,
and I mean, some of the other things that we're looking at too that are affecting all of this, like credit scores. Once again, it affected Black home ownership so much more. I mean, it's affecting everyone, but credit scores have affected Black people and some other marginalized groups, indigenous folks also in this country so disproportionately.
Keep in mind that a lot of these politicians who are telling people that it's their fault and they're not working hard enough are old enough that they were never judged by their credit score until they were already in politics and could take care of it.
And wealthy people don't care what their credit score is.
Well, wealthy people always have great credit.
Or they have terrible credit. A lot of wealthy people have garbage credit. I have a friend that does financial auditing, and let me tell you, tons of very, very rich people have terrible credit because it doesn't matter.
On paper.
Right.
I know what you mean on paper as far as the official rating.
Right. Their official number.
Have you ever seen, I think I've talked about this before, so the answer might be no already, but somebody may have seen it since I mentioned it the last time. There's a Gregory Peck movie, which is almost but not quite the whole basis for Trading Places later on with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, where these two old British guys give an American sailor a banknote for £1 million sterling, which is a lot more than $1 million. And it was even more than $1 million at the time the movie is set. But they give him a banknote for £1 million sterling and says he has to be able to go a set amount of time without ever cashing it. And these two old brothers have a bet going, just like Ralph Bellamy and Don Amici in Trading Places. Only instead of the bet being that these two people will end up living each other's lives if they swap them around somehow, their bet is, one guy says, this guy, by not ever spending the money, will be treated like he's rich as long as people think he's rich, which is what happens. And then when people so as long as people see the banknote and know he has it, they don't ask him to pay for anything. They extend him free credit with no questions asked. That's what being rich is like.
Yep.
One of the tricks, I heard this on somebody else's show of all things, but one of the tricks is people just borrow money. Rich people don't spend their own money. They borrow money and don't pay it back and get richer that way. Now think about that for a moment. They're stealing from the banks. Remember when it was such a big deal that Donald Trump had this horrible credit rating where no one would loan to him? Now think how much worse that is when all the rich people are already stealing from the banks. Not that I'm trying to single Trump out because he was such a horrible president. I'm talking strictly about the business stuff here. Mind you, I don't think he was a great president, but I don't have derangement syndrome either.
I don't go back. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, these comments, now that I've finished bloviating, I do want to get to these comments. Both of these, because, this is where we are. A lifetime dream to have a studio apartment by yourself without a roommate. That's exciting. And this, I think, directly has something to do with what we were talking about as far as BlackRock. People are being outbid by $20,000 to $100,000 over asking price.
Yep.
Now,
it's more common in Austin, Texas, too.
I believe that. Now, in Austin, though, there's a difference. Austin and Portland, because both Austin and Portland have tech industries. Austin and Portland have always had a problem with people from the Bay Area selling their really, really expensive houses in San Francisco or San Jose, quitting their job at Apple or one of the other Bay Area tech companies, getting a job in Portland or Austin at one of those tech companies, and then buying a house in Portland for like 50 to 100,000 over asking price because it's cheap here compared to San Francisco and San Jose. So we have experience with that. But now imagine that instead of it being, 10 or 20 people from California every year driving the prices up, everybody's being outbid by a corporation.
Yeah, that's a huge problem.
And now you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, back to what you're saying earlier about really the disparities with really Black working class people with housing. One of the big issues is economic immobility, in the sense that if you keep them poor, they stay in one place. Also due to redlining as well, we know. And also, too, if you keep someone at one place for a long time, they won't leave the district. So if you have a high population of Black people in an area, most of the time they're going to have one Black representative, but the entire state is either like super corrupt. And there's plenty of times you have another Black representative who could be corrupt too as well, like Val Demings or whatever, yada, yada. But it creates a political landscape. And they do that through gerrymandering too. But that's what makes it even difficult, not only to succeed economically, but politically too.
Well, I mean, it's important to understand, and this is sort of quiet and people don't always talk about it. But I mean, how Black Democrats keep their seats all the time in these gerrymandered southern states. You don't usually hear about the Black Democrats being gerrymandered out of their district. You only hear about the white Democrats being gerrymandered out of their districts. That's because there are deals in place that these states get to keep so many Black districts as long as the people in those districts play ball with both the crooked side of the Democratic Party and even the Republican Party and the white supremacists.
I didn't know about that one. That's
why their seats are relatively safe. We had Elijah Manley on my old show with my old partner. He was running for Congress. He was running for a state assembly in Florida, very young. State Senate in Florida, very young at 19. And he was talking about some of the stuff that was going on. And I mean, it's scary. And these are the people who are standing up in Congress and saying, we are going to tell you who the real white supremacists are, and you should listen to us. I mean, there are legitimate or were legitimate civil rights heroes in Congress. John Lewis was a legitimate civil rights hero and was better than some of the other folks in the South. There are also sort of civil rights heroes in Congress. James Clyburn has a spot on the Civil Rights Walk of Fame in Charleston, South Carolina. James Clyburn was heavily involved in civil rights activism in college, but he also went to work for a white Democratic governor who needed a Black advisor on civil rights in order to look less racist than he really was.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary about Reconstruction, about the end of slavery and how Congress and the radical Republicans, that's what the term was back then.
Yes.
How they wanted to punish the South and to really end slavery in America.
They wanted to, in order to punish the South, and it's important to understand that it was to punish the South. There were really good people in that Congress who really believed in the equality of all humankind. But there were also people in that Congress who really wanted to humiliate Southern white people by making them kowtow to black people. And there were some people who it was both. Some of the people who most wanted to make people kowtow to black people were also some of the biggest believers in civil rights because they thought it was only fair and just. That's why the first black senator in the United States came from Mississippi.
I think it's also worth noting there was this whole economic factor to a lot of that stuff too, where, you know, the Civil War was in many ways like the first fully economic industrial war, at least in this side of the globe. There was kind of, it was all about economic destruction. There were
second. I think the War of the River Plate started first. Fair. And that was that long 20, 30-year war between Paraguay and all its neighbors, where Paraguay lost after forever. I think it started before the Civil War, but it didn't end until like 10 or 15 years after.
I think that's what had me confusing. It took forever to end. But yeah, it was one of the first major conflicts where really it was critical to destroy the economic power of your enemy specifically. And both sides considered this paramount. It wasn't just because that was what made sense militarily. It was because on both sides, they had pressure from corporations of the time. True. They might not have called themselves corporations back then, but whatever. And you know, telling the powers on each side, this is what we need to have happen. We need you to destroy these factories because that's our competitor. And there was essentially kind of two parallel economies running in the United States, which is a big part of what brought us to war, was these two economies that didn't fit together. Had less to do with cultures not fitting in some ways than just economics not fitting, because that's what really drives war most of the time is somebody wants to make more money.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, if you look at our capitalistic system we have, there's consolidation and there's breaking things apart. So I guess what you're saying too, economically, if you have two separate economies, northern and the southern, pretty much sectorally, some in the south, a western economy, southern, midwestern, northeastern economy. If you have like a civil war scenario that takes place, you have different industries competing each other. It could be prime opportunity depending on how big your influence is over the union government versus the segregationist type of government. You could tell, hey, if you get rid of my competition, I can consolidate and I can be more useful to you, you know? So that could be a scenario that probably played about. I wouldn't doubt it.
And it doesn't mean there weren't any real serious segregationists in government, because I believe that even Abraham Lincoln himself was very serious about, anti-segregationist. Anti-segregationists in the government, because I think Abraham Lincoln himself was actually a staunch anti-segregationist. He just couldn't always say it out loud because it was politically difficult to say. But if you read his private letters, he seems pretty clear on where he stood.
He had, and you can see him evolve too. You can see early private letters from before the war where he says all sorts of different things. And you can see stuff, you can see in his private stuff in the Civil War how Lincoln is getting more and more radical as the war goes on.
Right. So, but even if that was the case, if there were some true anti-slavery heroes in the government, it doesn't mean that they weren't being influenced, or even more importantly, allowed to exist in the government because someone had decided it was economically beneficial.
I'll mention somebody important since we're talking about anti-slavery heroes. Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, who was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee during Radical Reconstruction and the big mover behind the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Thaddeus Stevens was a serious anti-racist, as much as anybody could be in those days. He spent like the last couple months of his life desperately trying to get the right for black people to vote passed in Pennsylvania. And he found out that it didn't pass like a few days before he died. And so he died feeling like his life had been worthless.
Yeah, that's rough.
And this is important to understand too. And this is a big part of why Radical Reconstruction failed. You had that level of racism in the North. Frederick Douglass said in 1876, talking about the first centennial of the country, that it was kind of scary because the white people were all making friends again. And if war between the whites had been really good for black people, well, what would peace between the whites mean for black people? And sure enough, radical Reconstruction ended violently. It ended with shooting wars between the Klan and the occupation forces in many states. In Texas, John Wesley Hardin became a famous gunfighter and hero after he got angry and got into a gunfight and killed one of the black Reconstruction cops, because they specifically formed a state police force to replace the Texas Rangers and made them all black. So you had black people policing white people in Texas, and the white people didn't like it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty crazy. And what you're saying about how at the time it may have been beneficial for the two different white people in the North versus the South fighting, because you would, at least if they're fighting each other, they'd be less paying attention to black people. Well, but I think what's interesting too about your statement about that violently ending is that when Reconstruction really started ending, when most people don't realize this, but black people really could vote for a short period of time in the mid 1800s, mostly because the radical Republicans, they would send in national troops.
They could vote in the South.
In the South, yes.
They could run for office in the South.
Exactly. You had some of the first black senators, first black Congress people there during that time. One of the big issues is that you would constantly need federal troops in the South to make sure you protect black people to be able to vote. And the problem with that is that you had the rise of the Klan and many of these white supremacist groups who would come into the towns, terrorize, stand outside voter polls, and you need federal troops 2 to 1 just to stop them, just to ensure that black people can vote. And the problem is white liberals in the North, they got tired.
Yes.
And white Southerners in the South, they will die and go to hell. So they were not getting tired. So
it's not even just about tired. Remember what I said about Pennsylvania and Thaddeus Stevens dying a broken man because he couldn't get black people the right to vote in his own state when he died. Now, this is the man who was most responsible for black people being able to vote in Mississippi and South Carolina and Louisiana, where they had never had that right before. But he couldn't pass it in his own state because people in Pennsylvania were willing to let black people vote in the South to punish white Southerners, but they were not willing to let their black neighbors vote. You cannot underestimate the importance of that Northern racism. That Northern racism that Northerners love to pretend doesn't exist is what always comes around to screw over black people in the end. You read a lot. All the big successes that Martin Luther King Jr. had were in the South with the support of white Northerners. At the advice of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. went north to tackle big city housing issues in places like New York and Detroit and Chicago, and people would not listen to him. They didn't literally run him out of town, but they might as well have. Even in the 1960s, white racists in the North were willing to support civil rights in Mississippi, but not support civil rights in their own neighborhood.
I think, too, that it also depends on the cultural and political dynamics versus North versus the South. The South is, in terms of that time period, was very more outspoken with their racism, while the Midwest, and even say it's a little bit more subtle. And the South is more in your face with it, like, hey, don't come on my yard, it won't be any problem. So the North, they'll talk shit about you behind your back and cut you off economically without you even knowing about it. And so in the South, even Martin Luther King, in some of his, when I was been watching a lot of documentaries and movies about it, he said it's easier in the South in this instance because you got guys like Bull Connor from the South, and the reason why he said it was easier to go after Bull Connor versus
such obvious bad guys.
Obvious mad guys. He knows that, okay, we're going to peacefully protest, And we know if we push that button, but we're peaceful, they're going to obliterate us. But that's a good thing, because then the Northerners will, oh my God, what's going on?
And that was the whole thing. When people saw black kids being attacked by police dogs and blown around by fire hoses, they're like, oh shit, we got to do something. But when it's just, redlining or lending discrimination or charging a higher interest rate for the black family than for the white family, out of sight, out of mind.
I think it's also worth noting, and I'll also talk about homophobia a little bit here, because it's similar in this regard, that it's kind of easier in some ways to at least have a conversation when it's out in the open, right? Like if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, faggot, that's a really terrible way to start a dialogue, but they started one.
And they started it honestly.
It is a conversation now, but when liberals have fired me from jobs and then I didn't know why, and then I found out later, oh, they thought that you were a little too gay at work. Then that's I can't engage with that. That person has never given me an opportunity to speak to them about what they believe. So even that person that is horrible at least is opening a door. And I think that's one difference that is sometimes encountered between the South and the North, is that these white liberals in the North, they don't open the door to a dialogue. They aren't interested in discussing what they believe with anyone. They aren't interested in changing it, period.
Well, it's not that they didn't open the door, it's that you don't have the chance to correct the record. I think that's what you're getting at. I don't think them opening a door by calling you the F word in that instance or all that is that helpful. I guess what you're saying, what I can agree with is that for some, people, for instance, if you have some white supremacist say the N-word to me, I'm going to get pissed off, but at least I can cuss them out, tell them about themselves too. So at least it's one-on-one, and then we go about our merry day. But if it's a white liberal doing that, especially in an office setting or in a place of business, it's a little bit different nowadays. Of course, corporations, they do not want to get caught with that. They don't look what happened to. Look what happened to Sarah Cooper when she called the cops on a black guy in Central Park. Yeah, she got fired from her job literally the next day. But I guess what you're saying is that it kind of makes it easier one-on-one to debunk that person, get rid of them, versus you being in an office setting, and it's kind of hard to track down. You have, instead of it being 1v1, then it becomes 1v 20.
Well, so and also, the liberal way of doing racism or doing homophobia or doing any kind of bigotry is to hide it behind so many layers that you don't even always know who to be mad at, right? If you get redlined out of your housing because you're a marginalized poor person living in a city, getting screwed over by some politician, you don't even know which politician screwed you sometimes, right? Was it your city councilor, your state senator, the president? I actually don't know, people run into that problem all the time where they don't even know who to be mad at or who to confront. And so ugly in your face bigotry is horrible, but it is something that you can speak to directly. But it's these inhumane policies you can't even speak to. And that's what scares me about liberalism sometimes, is the way that they've put these layers between all of the inhumaneness to where it's so hard to even confront it a lot of the time because you can't figure out where it starts or where it ends.
I think even today it's being even more complex. I think starting off with Reconstruction, then the Civil Rights era, even into now, for good context, look at what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida right now, banning protests. And so that's the type of conservatism where it's yeah, bitch, what you gonna do about it? I'm gonna do it. And I'm gonna sign the law in your fucking face, and I'm not gonna bullshit you about what I'm doing. That governor is gonna say, yeah, I'm pretty much anti-LGBTQ. Hey, I'm anti-protesting. Hey, I'm anti-black people. What you gonna do about it? Nothing. While there's the liberal, they'll bullshit you into a more, principled stance about why they can't do it. It's like Biden right now and his administration maneuvering his way to why he sided with the corporations versus the LGBTQ.
Or worse, all these so-called progressives staying quiet and mostly just supporting Biden. And when Joe Scarborough says, you've been really quiet while Biden was president, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, well, thank you so much.
And just to give some context about what's going on with there, most people don't know, Joe Scarborough was in the United States House of Representatives in the early 2000s. He was a Republican. Yes. And he was precursor to the Tea Party, but it still doesn't diminish. It still doesn't diminish the asshole. See, they just got more.
I will say one thing, and this is not a compliment because this isn't good, but this is the difference that we've been talking about between hypocrisy and not hypocrisy. Which is not to say he's not hypocritical in other ways, but
sure,
Joe Scarborough was one of the group of people who were conservative enough that they went out of their way to take Newt Gingrich down as Speaker of the House when they thought he went too far.
Wow.
Joe Scarborough was one of the people who was responsible for Newt Gingrich getting replaced, or at least he tries to take credit for it.
Wasn't Newt Gingrich Newt Gingrich ran for president in 2008, but I forgot.
Newt Gingrich ran for president a couple of times and was a very vocal Trump supporter.
Yeah, he still is too. That's
which is scary because whatever else you want to say about Newt Gingrich is not a Trump guy, despite having a name that makes you think so.
Yeah, and back to the Joe Scarborough situation, he was the precursor to the Tea Party. One of the things he said is that back then, it's kind of similar to now. The whole Republican mantra is that anytime taxes are raised, raise holy hell. Anytime the debt ceiling, the debt, raise holy hell. And he admitted that back then, I was rambunctious. I went toe to toe with the establishment. But he's like, I admire how you guys have bit your tongue. The progressive, you bit your tongue. You didn't go as crazy. And AOC was like, thank you. And it's like, what? Like what? Like you see, it's like you see that being quiet and being a little person who just sits there and doesn't do anything isn't how you garner attention.
No,
and it's not. It may get you praise from Republicans like Joe Scarborough, but it's not going to get you praise from a lot of other Democrats who aren't in office already.
Right.
And just look at.
And I want to share something since you guys mentioned, we mentioned Biden. Now, let me find it.
While you're pulling that up, this will also tie in nicely. RJ, I wanted to say earlier your point about how the liberals will kind of sell the same horrible thing to you as a good thing. That's a big part of what's been so insidious to me about the Biden presidency. And this is what I tried to warn people about before he was elected is that, if we're not careful, he's going to get away with so many worse things because he's going to be held to this completely unaccountable standard of he's not Trump. Yay. Let's all go back to brunch.
I literally want to deck someone who says that. Literally just want to deck them.
Yeah.
I'm so done. Just deck, stop. I'm literally done. I literally saw something a couple of days ago in which Biden has been doing the G7 summit, which the world of white supremacists come together for world domination. That's basically what happens. And the crazy part is that Biden chewed out a female press reporter, and afterwards he went back and apologized for it. And of course, that's Biden understanding the political scenario. And the entire press corps is like, oh my gosh, that's so different than under Trump. Trump would have never apologized. Oh my God, look at Biden.
How well can folks see this right now? Let me know.
I can look on my phone.
What are they even talking about? Trump was great at half-ass apologies.
No, I don't think
Yeah, it looks like Millennial Lefty agrees with me that anytime people say that Biden's just slightly better than Trump, that he wants to deck them too. So we got team deck all the people who say Biden's slightly better than Trump.
Good, because I was thinking of it too. This sucks.
So this is the proof that Biden's not better than Trump. And this is something I would really like somebody to ask Bernie Sanders about, and AOC about, and Rashida Tlaib about. New U.S. military training document calls socialists a terrorist ideology and lists them alongside neo-Nazis amid Pentagon crackdown on domestic extremism per counterterrorism training material leaked to me. Me, in this case, being Ken Klippenstein of the Intercept. And he goes ahead and
I think
shows.
you could just say of the internet.
I mean, his Twitter trolling of Republicans may actually be better than his journalism, and that's saying a lot because his journalism is great. But think about this: we have socialists who were telling us that we had to support Biden because Biden was better than Trump. And Biden declared and Biden's military publishes a manual declaring socialists a terrorist threat. This isn't Trump's military.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing that Trump has done to that is when he wanted to put Antifa on the terrorist watch list, I believe.
Now, to be fair, Trump murdered a member of Antifa.
Oh, shit.
A gentleman here in Oregon, in one of the Portland protests, shot a white supremacist in self-defense and defending his fellow protesters. He then had to go into hiding because he was immediately declared a murderer by the cops. And Trump sent the U.S. Marshals to kill him, not arrest him, to kill him.
Yep.
And he was killed without a chance to defend himself.
Wow. I mean, I can't say that's new that the state just kills someone without a trial.
They do it, but this was, and this is what makes it different. And Black people may say, well, it's about time. At least it's fair. But white people who have even the smallest lack of sympathy for Black people should understand this was a white guy who Trump had murdered. This wasn't some Black guy who was a Muslim who got radicalized by the FBI in an internet sting and convinced to commit a terrorist act so they could kill him. This was a white guy at a protest who shot someone in self-defense. That's a white guy shooting someone in self-defense is usually pretty easy to convince a jury that you shot someone in self-defense. Sometimes even when you didn't. But no, in this case, they murdered him. They didn't want him to go to trial. Maybe because they thought he might get away with it if he went to trial. But that's something that white people who have not been sympathetic to this stuff we've been saying about cops really need to think about.
All that self-defense shit, it always turns out to be a hypocritical situation with what they believe about it anyway, because you've seen this all over the last year with masks. Okay, if a business owner feels threatened during a BLM protest and attacks a random protester, conservatives rush out and go, "Oh, that poor business owner," and even quote unquote centrists will, and some liberals will, rush to those people. "Oh, the business owner, blah blah." For some reason, business owners don't get that same treatment from those same people if they attack someone for not wearing a mask in their store. Like, do you think that there's a reason why there's a double standard applied to this shit? Because it seems kind of ridiculous to me how we're supposed to believe that there's this hoorah, good guy with a gun culture in America, except it only actually applies to some people, and it's really fucking obvious.
Well, so you understand that white supremacists think they're the only real Americans. Not just that white people are the only real Americans, which lots of liberals think too, but that white supremacists are the only Americans. The way that the American Legion described it when they were first formed, in order to disguise their white supremacy, was that they called it 100% Americanism. But 100% Americanism meant you were a WASP. And they specifically didn't allow Black World War I veterans to join the American Legion, which doesn't make it a huge surprise that the American Legion turned into thugs to be deployed in a paramilitary fashion against working class people and Black people trying to argue for their rights.
You got a comment.
Yes, and that's a good comment. This is true. Something that was...
I thought I couldn't get more depressed than talking about Joe Biden, but talking about Andrew Yang actually makes me more cynical,
So,
I think.
he had an event very early in the primary, which was on YouTube, but not TV, and which has never shown up on TV, which shows you that Yang has been protected in a way that Bernie hasn't. Yang thinks Asians have to prove themselves, which is white supremacist dog whistles. Yes, it absolutely is, Dylan. Also, in addition to that being a white supremacist dog whistle, early in an event that made it to YouTube but not television, he said to a mostly white audience that he was very concerned about the white birth rate. Now, I'm a white guy, and I don't worry about the white birth rate as much as Yang did. There's only one kind of white person who really worries that much about the white birth rate, and that's people who are worried about getting replaced, which means, the Nazis.
Yeah, about Andrew Yang, it's kind of... Andrew Yang is revealing himself to be more of a piece of shit every single fucking day. Like, he literally is a Hillary Clinton Democrat, culturally, in this instance, because he starts off with high approval ratings. Everyone loves him. But the more he opens his fucking mouth, his poll numbers die. It's the Hillary Clinton effect. That's
and yet his gung-ho fans swear he's the second coming, which is exactly the same again.
Well, they're kind of proving themselves and what they're really about too, because
True.
I know a lot of people that,
Exactly, Dylan. Sorry, Kennedy.
Yeah, no,
Exactly.
no, this is fine.
Who gives a fuck about white birth rates? I don't get how people care.
Well, no, let's talk about this for a second, because here's the thing. You can only really give a shit about this if you have a certain kind of view about who is human and who isn't. Mm-hmm. If all you care about is that, like, I feel like I just hope the human race kind of like makes it through climate change and survives. And it'd be awesome if we like actually like became a space settling civilization someday, even if it's far beyond my lifetime, things like that, like
as long as it's not on Elon Musk's terms.
I don't care what the humans look like in 300 years that are doing that, because I just want the human race to continue and it doesn't matter to me. So for these people to feel that way, they have to, it's because they exclude certain people from the category of humanity. That's the reality of it. They really just don't see the people around them as human, and that's hard to accept as anybody who has empathy, but that's how these people are, and that's part of why we have to be so harsh, completely harsh and unforgiving in the way that we treat fascists, because what they believe is so terribly dangerous.
And just connect to the racial undertones as well as the complete ignorance of class by even guys like Joe Biden. Look at all the videos of Joe Biden. Joe Biden doesn't say that Black people don't have the access or don't have the money because of systemic racism as to why they can't afford attorneys or certain other public service goods. Joe Biden just says we're not intelligent enough. We don't understand. So like, that's another white supremacist dog whistle.
So look at, that, and that's been part of Democratic Party policy since 1965. I put the link on Twitter once, so anybody who hadn't actually read it before could literally read it. It's called The Crisis of the Black Family. It is more properly known as the Moynihan Report to a lot of people. That's how they've always heard about it in the media when it's discussed. it doesn't get talked about much anymore. It used to get talked about a lot. The Moynihan Report basically blames Black parents for raising stupid children and blames Black parents for many social problems. It doesn't do so explicitly. It uses very paternalistic and savior-like language to disguise its racism, but it blames Black parents for raising stupid children.
Yeah, at least with, and that's the thing. Like, that's the type of frosting on a shit cake that they do, which makes it very difficult to fight. So, like, when Joe Biden says that poor kids are just as talented and bright as Black kids, it's like,
as white kids.
One, you completely ignore the class element.
Yes.
At the same time, you're telling a really Black people of color, that it's not because it's not because you're poor or whatever. It's because you don't understand or you don't know. You're intelligent.
You got to play those records all night. Remember from the debate?
Yeah,
you got to get the gramophone out.
Yeah, leave the record player on at night. Joe Biden. This is why Obama picked Joe Biden. Let's be real. Like, if you look at Democratic Party history in terms of how the primaries work, let's start with 1960. 1960, the primaries, it was John F. Kennedy versus Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, John F. Kennedy squeaked it out.
1960, this is where it gets complicated. In 1960, they still chose the candidates at the convention. I don't think Kennedy and Johnson actually ran in any primaries. I may be wrong.
No, they ran against each other.
But did they? In a couple? Okay, so I know.
And I know that because Kennedy, he went through the primary process of going state to state. Mm-hmm. Kennedy, by being the Senate Majority Leader of the Democratic Party since 1955 and being the establishment guy, he believed that he didn't have to go through it and was entitled to just go to the convention floor and get the votes. Mm-hmm. So that's why I know that.
In 1964, there were only three Republican primaries where both candidates ran. New Hampshire, California, and I think the other one was Oregon, but I won't swear to that. But there were three primaries where they ran. And in New Hampshire, Henry Cabot Lodge upset both Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller. In California, Nelson Rockefeller won. And in the last state, Goldwater won. Now, think about this. In the three primaries where both Goldwater and Rockefeller ran against each other, somebody else won New Hampshire, Rockefeller won California, and Goldwater won another state. Now, just by those numbers, who has the most delegates? Nelson Rockefeller. Because even though California wasn't as big as it is now, in 1964, California had still experienced the World War II boom, in which the aircraft industry in California became the biggest industry in the country, and the post-World War II Hollywood boom, where Hollywood expanded outside of the movies itself, and all sorts of Hollywood money was going into Los Angeles in general in order to build itself around this Hollywood image of itself as a city. And that's when you start seeing the cooperation between Hollywood and the LAPD, and Hollywood and various other government institutions in California, to present a certain image of California as the best place in the country.
Yeah, every state wants to be the best state and the best place in the country. And
well, the police chief of Los Angeles was William Parker, was the second most famous cop in the country after J. Edgar Hoover in the 1950s. And he was a corrupt, racist son of a bitch. But he doesn't have a Bull Connor reputation. He has a J. Edgar Hoover reputation, even though J. Edgar Hoover was also a corrupt, racist son of a bitch.
It's all about play of words. Bull Connor outward racist.
Yes.
Edgar
Outwardly
Hoover,
brutal, horrible human being.
exactly. And J. Edgar Hoover, same thing, but more like institutional.
Yes.
So it's very crazy. Like I think it was Roosevelt who created the FBI, right? I think that was and he used
FDR made the FBI official. Before the FBI, they had the Bureau of Investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Roosevelt made the Bureau. I believe it was Roosevelt who made the Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and empowered them to go after the most dangerous criminals in the country during the Depression. At which time, J. Edgar Hoover was denying that the mafia even existed while chasing bank robbers. Now think about this for a moment. We're denying that the mafia, a corrupt institution that reaches into every business in a city and corrupts them and steals from them and gets an extra dollar out of everything in a way that hurts everybody who has to put money into those businesses because it makes everything more expensive, is ignored by J. Edgar Hoover. And these people who rob banks are public enemy number one. Now think about that, because when you rob a bank, you're not really stealing from the people who have money in the bank, because their money is all invested. It's all out on loan, or you're stealing the bank's reserves. But the bank then plays it off as if its customers are being robbed.
That's some deep stuff right there.
So when people talk about robbing, it's even worse now. If you think about it, we've gone to all these security measures to make bank robbery in the way it used to happen almost impossible. But now bank money is all insured. The only person you're stealing from if you rob a bank is the insurance company and the federal government. You're not even stealing from the bank.
Now I know why there's so many security measures put in place.
Exactly.
So, and I just want to add on to what you were talking about with like the convention stuff. And I think it connects too about, I said too, why Obama picked Joe Biden is because if you look back in what happened in 1960s primary, I explained Lyndon Johnson, Senate Majority Leader at the time, ran for president, felt entitled not to go through the primary process because he was the establishment. He felt it was his time to be president. And then Kennedy, by being the young senator from Massachusetts, junior senator, he went through the primary process to get the will of the people.
Yeah.
And so it goes down to the convention. John F. Kennedy squeaks it away, but he didn't squeak it away. He's leading the delegate count, but he realizes that he needs the South. And how he gets the South is Lyndon B. Johnson, Senate Majority Leader. Now, why Lyndon B. Johnson? Because Lyndon B. Johnson, he's the key to the Dixiecrats.
Yes.
He can get them to go along.
Yes.
But they don't have to be happy, but he can get them to go along.
What's more, and this is Lyndon Johnson, and this is why it's almost insulting to Johnson to compare Biden to Johnson. Lyndon Johnson felt that even though some of Kennedy's policies were not necessarily his policies, that it was his duty to push those through. And he actually ended up being more radical and involved on civil rights than Kennedy. And he's like one of the most racist presidents we've ever had on a personal level. Exactly. But on a systemic level, he's the least racist president we've ever had.
The bar is low. But...
True, the bar is low. I'm not saying it, but that on a systemic level, the least racist president ever was the most personally racist president ever who didn't own slaves, at least.
Yeah. Also too, I forgot he had his vice president at the time, and he got this vice president after the unfortunate assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey was Hubert Humphrey was the most liberal senator from Minnesota.
Yes.
From that time, he was beloved. He was the one guy that had conversations with MLK and many of these other civil rights leaders. And to your point about Johnson, which is interesting, is that even after the assassination of JFK, Johnson knew that this was the moment to consolidate his political career. Because his entire career, look at how Johnson started, so you understand what we're getting at here. Johnson, when he started, he ran for the House of Representatives. He ran as a New Deal Democrat in the 1930s. He admired Franklin Roosevelt. He ran it, and by the way, this is in blue Texas. So talk about a spot of winning. Okay, but then he runs for Senate during the exact same time under the New Deal way, which didn't work in the South because the entire economic structure in the South is different from the North still. In the South, it's oil barons and all that type of stuff, big capitalism in the South. And so he loses the first time. And actually, he lost the first time because he got cheated. They stuffed the ballot box. So yes, that type of voter fraud did happen back then. People who were dead had voted. People voted multiple times in those senatorial elections. Johnson actually wrote a memoir about how pissed he was about that. And also, too, his second time coming around where he ran against Pappy Leo Daniels, Pass the Biscuits Pappy. There were also concerns about voter fraud, too, during that time because they even accused Johnson of cheating because he was so paranoid about his first senatorial loss that he wanted to make sure he got the second one right because his wife, Lady Bird, Claudia Lady Bird Johnson, who's his wife, she invested United States dollars equivalent today of $250,000 of her inheritance into his campaigns. That's a lot of marriage pressure.
Yes, it is. You got to win with that.
Yeah, so even Lady Bird said at the end of her life was the best investment she ever made. I mean, obviously, because Lyndon Johnson he went from a New Deal Democrat to really a crooked corporate Democrat because he sided with big industry, oil barons. I mean, back then,
and he had one of the most undeserving silver stars ever awarded to a member of the military. He literally took he was literally awarded a silver star for what was essentially a senatorial ride-along. Yes, he had a military rank but he was in the reserves and he was never in any sort of hazardous situation except once where he was essentially doing a ride-along as a senator. But because of his political connections and because the plane was in combat, he was awarded a silver star for riding along with them.
That's crazy.
Makes Pete Buttigieg look like a real war hero.
He actually spent 6 months in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
6 whole months. That's a lot longer than one plane ride, people.
Well, to be fair, we do not know how long he was in naval intelligence without telling anyone before that.
True.
Years.
Yes,
we actually know to some extent how long he was in naval intelligence. We may not know the full extent of it, but there are some records, and he was in naval intelligence for at least 3 years prior to that.
The simple fact is that while McKinsey does a lot of corporate consulting, they're also highly spook adjacent. They do a lot of stuff for countries that the CIA doesn't want to do stuff for officially. McKinsey does stuff like, now this is an example, and I don't have any proof that they were in any way involved with this. I want to be clear that I am not trying to slander McKinsey. But let's say you're a prince in Saudi Arabia, and you want to know how to kill a journalist who lives in America and get away with it.
Allegedly.
And you can't get to the CIA because that would be too obvious. You hire McKinsey. Now, I'm not saying that that's what happened in that specific case, but that's the sort of thing McKinsey does for heads of state.
Let's strip away all this layers of unaccountability and stuff, because it just seems to me, even without all of the obfuscation, or especially without it, really is what I'm getting at, that there's shouldn't it constitute some kind of conflict of interest to be on the naval intelligence payroll and be the mayor of a place?
Well,
that seems like two things you shouldn't be allowed to do at the same time.
Let's keep in mind something. This is the most important part of that whole thing. I'm glad you mentioned conflict of interest. So it's illegal for a soldier to be caught behind enemy lines in civilian clothes or the wrong uniform. Being caught in the enemy's uniform behind enemy lines or in civilian clothes and therefore pretending not to be a soldier is espionage. That was enough to get people shot in the Napoleonic Wars. The exploring officers who did the intelligence work for the Duke of Wellington in Spain were these total insane whack jobs who rode around behind enemy lines in full fucking uniform because it was more important not to get shot if they did get caught than not to get caught.
That's crazy.
Because if you were caught and exchanged, you could still report your intelligence. But if you were shot, you couldn't tell the Duke of Wellington shit. So they were crazy motherfuckers who rode around behind the French lines in their full uniform and talked to people in their full uniform with everybody knowing who they were.
You got a nice comment there.
Yeah, no, that is a lot of people got shot during the Napoleonic War. But like most wars, more people died of disease and starvation than wounds.
But they did get shot before they died of disease or starvation. I just want to be clear.
Some of them. But that's the other thing, is that during the Napoleonic War, being wounded was likely a career ender. There were exceptions. There were people who suffered wounds that they miraculously recovered from in various ways. But you have to remember that
don't those depend on the type of artillery, like
the muskets?
Oh, you're still using musket. Yeah,
the muskets that people the British had riflemen, but the French didn't. Napoleon thought that rifles were too slow, and so you had a disadvantage because you had to take longer to reload,
right? And
you had to take longer to aim. Right. Whereas with muskets, you just fired a volley, and somebody was sure to hit somebody. Yeah. And so Napoleon thought that rifles were a waste of time, but the British didn't. The British had riflemen who did specific jobs at specific times, a lot of times behind the enemy lines in uniform stuff.
Yeah, it's always weird when you see, like, back even the Napoleon years to even towards the American Revolutionary War. But what's funny is, like, these, like, muskets, for instance, like these little tiny balls for ammunition.
That's the thing. It wasn't. Those muskets in the Napoleonic Wars were like, it seems small when you look at it, but that was like a 50 to 60 caliber bullet. Ooh, the Brown Bess musket, which was the British weapon of choice, was a 58 caliber. The Baker rifle, which was the rifled version of the same gun, was a bullet with the and there were grooves cut in the barrel, so it wasn't like a musket bolt, but that was also a 58 caliber round. So these were big bullets. And if a big 50 caliber bullet made of lead hits you, it splatters out like this, which means that the exit wound, if it goes through you, is worse than the entry wound. And that if it hits anything important, it does a massive amount of damage. So if you were shot in the arm or the leg, it was probably going to be amputated because that ball would just smash through that bone.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, because I saw a couple of documentaries with that, and wow, it's a giant hole, and plus you can't even do surgery on something like that. Like it's, like you said, you have to be amputated.
But I wanted to point out that we think a 45 is a big round these days, but those small-looking bullets were 58 caliber, more than a half inch in diameter.
What do you think of? You mentioned too how, like, the British had riflemen. What always concerned me about, like, even when the British and the Americans were having their war, the Revolutionary War, it was interesting how the British would have like all the officers, like specifically the high-ranking officials on horses, directing the lower rank privates or who to shoot and who to shoot at, and they would all be in like uniform lines, and they would be using like this slow ammunition. And what was funny is that the Americans in that war, they were viewed by the British as like lesser than and some of these other different type of words. And what the Americans would do is instead of shooting the lower officers, they would just shoot the generals. And I think the British didn't understand this because the British, all the intelligence was in the high-ranking officer on the horse. So if you shoot the high-ranking officer, all their lower ones, they don't know what the fuck to do. And so the Americans, they just peeled them off one by one.
That's a big part of it. Well, that was what the British did too, though. The British riflemen targeted officers. Those were they were looking to cut the head off the monster, so to speak, which makes it funny that that's what the Americans did to them. The difference was, and this was a huge difference, the British had 2 battalions of riflemen in the entire British Army. And those 2 battalions of riflemen were used in various detachment sizes as these elite Green Beret types who worked behind enemy lines and who were split up between other units in battle to work as skirmishers. The rifles would be along a skirmish line with the other light troops in front of the infantry lines. And then you'd have 3 ranks deep of the main line troops. So the French would be coming through the skirmish line, and the musketeers in the skirmish line would be firing in barrage, while the riflemen in the skirmish line sort of moved around and sniped at officers. Ooh, and then you had to get, and the attacking French army had to get through that skirmish line to even close with the main British line troops, and that's why Wellington. But yes, that's a good one. What was the original topic?
Okay, I think
that is the defining question. We were talking about. We were talking about everybody getting shot during the Napoleonic War. Basically, what we were saying is that, as regards to Pete Buttigieg, he was doing something among the American civilian population that would have gotten him shot by the Taliban if he had done it in Afghanistan.
I think it was even farther back than that, because you were talking about like Nelson Rockefeller. Remember we were talking about.
Well, we talked about that too, but somebody mentioned Buttigieg.
Oh, that was Kennedy.
Yes, and he talked about we talked about Buttigieg being in. I'm going to stop touching my hair. Sorry. We talked about Buttigieg being secretly working for Navy intelligence for a reasonable amount of time without anybody knowing about it, which is illegal. If he is doing anything domestic, then that's posse comitatus. That's against the law. If he was doing anything overseas and not in uniform doing it, or not declaring himself a member of the military while doing it, that's espionage. Not Espionage Act espionage, but real, we shoot you for it espionage. Like the equivalent of the Rosenbergs giving the H-bomb to the A-bomb to the Soviets espionage. So we're talking serious stuff now, the stuff that people have been executed for. And he was doing this with nobody knowing.
I love the comment in the chat.
Almost out in the open. Also, yeah, that comment. Listen. Like 70% plus of leftists are also like military nerds to some extent. I feel like we just hide it.
I'm a history nerd.
History.
Yeah, well,
remember,
military history in particular, I love too. So that's also it all ties back.
Remember, if
Just
you
reading
even if you're
books.
not even if you're not a Marxist, if you studied Marx, the fundamental core line principles of Marx are based on a dialectical study of history. So if you are involved in any sort of left politics enough to read Marx, then you think about things at least somewhat in a historical frame.
I agree 100% with that. Like if you look at, so like Marx in one of his books, he was talking about like the shipping industry and how like we cut off one canal, it ruined the entire shipping industry in the Middle East. And that's exactly what happened earlier this year with that one ship, like going sideways and cut off that canal,
blocking the whole Suez Canal.
Yeah, the Suez Canal. So instead of going straight through, going to the Mediterranean, people have to go around Africa, which is like a longer trip, right? So that's the funny part. I'm not really sure how Buttigieg is our American version.
Isn't fun.
Now, I get where she's going.
Just the like, Putin intelligence.
Spook, remember?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Now, the American Putin, or the closest thing to an American version of Putin, was not Buttigieg. Because remember, Putin was I believe running the KGB at one point. Which brings us to George H.W. Bush.
Oh, that's
Bobby Bush, the only president to be director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yes,
and the RNC too. He was the establishment.
Well, he was Nixon's RNC boss,
and he was the one that told Nixon to resign.
He was one of the people who told Nixon to resign.
Yeah.
He was also one of the people who tried to muscle a Republican senator to call his brother off investigating Spiro Agnew in Maryland.
Really? Was that the same thing for tax evasion, or was that something different?
It was the bribery and corruption and tax evasion. Remember, now, I am not a huge Rachel Maddow fan, but if you want to understand exactly what was going on with the Spiro Agnew investigation during the whole Watergate crap, because remember, the two were not connected. Spiro Agnew went down for his own shit, totally unconnected to Watergate. The Spiro Agnew investigation, the absolute best coverage of the whole thing is a podcast by Rachel Maddow called The Bagman. And it is worth listening to no matter how much you hate Rachel Maddow, because it goes into deep detail about how they busted him and the deal they made and why he got off so easily. And basically, he was allowed to plead guilty to a single charge of tax evasion and resign from the vice presidency without serving any jail time in order to allow them to continue with Watergate with less interference.
Yep.
And the idea was that they had him dead to rights on so many things, mostly bribery related, that if he actually went to trial, he would be facing serious time.
He was already old as shit then too, so that's like life.
He could have. Well, he was relatively young as vice presidents go, but he was still not a spring chicken as far as, I think he was in his 50s maybe. But no, it's worth noting that, he wasn't a spring chicken. He wasn't a young guy. 20, 30 years in prison wouldn't have gone well for him.
I agree 100%. And what you're saying about Rachel Maddow, people already seem to realize that Rachel Maddow, way back when, was actually kind of good.
A serious journalist. No, up until 2016, she was the only person talking about Flint in the mainstream media for a long time. And then she stopped and went completely to all Russia all the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, and what always fascinated me about Watergate is that, And how it connects with Russiagate, what you're saying right now, is that I used to be a huge Rachel Maddow listener, not really fan. Like I used to listen to like all mainstream media back in 2018 when I used to be a resistance liberal. And I listened to Rachel Maddow all the time and all this type of stuff. And like she had like she would go weeks doing like sagas and segments, continuing series of like Russiagate. And I remember when impeachment first started of Donald Trump, the first one with Russiagate, like she did an entire show about how it connects with like Watergate and Russiagate. It was ridiculous.
Michael Isikoff, who was going on MSNBC a lot, went on one of the leftist podcasts recently and was basically admitting, oh yeah, we kind of fucked up that Russiagate thing. And I kind of let some of these people lead me around by the nose in ways that I wouldn't if I did it all over again. So one of the two reporters, Michael Isikoff and David Korn, were the two people who were on Rachel Maddow all the time talking Russia, Russia, Russia. One of them has basically, and they wrote a book together, which was the Russiagate expose. One of them has basically said, yeah, I was wrong.
Yeah, that's some powerful shit there, you know. And if you compare the news coverage of Watergate versus Russiagate, it is wildly
It's a good compliment.
You know, so like look at, thank you for the compliment. I know QR Socialist, we're good mutuals on Twitter, so I really appreciate this. And I just love history, so I think like it's great to talk about this and how it differs. So how Russiagate in our current political scenario differs from Watergate back in the 70s is because look at how the media played out. You had essentially NBC, ABC. You had ABC, NBC, and CBS. Some of the bigger ones. How they would cover it was different. And you had Walter Cronkite, you had some of these bigger guys on there. And if you look at the Watergate coverage from even the tapings, they would put it prime time. Mm-hmm. And everybody was glued to the TV. It wasn't on fucking C-SPAN where you have to check it out later. Everybody just tuned into it. And they would kind of replay the news based on what they're seeing. And look at how the United States senators and Congress people during those committees, they actually knew what the fuck they were talking about. It's not like
we're better at faking it, at least.
Or at least, but yeah, like they at least knew like some concepts, would ask decent questions. And the reason why I say that in that instance is because, well, yeah, you're right too about the faking it part. I mean, look at today's context of some senators. Like anytime a tech guy like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg comes on, how do you make money off of this app?
You run ads, but that's not how they really do it.
Yeah.
And and he lied, and they let him get away with lying.
Yeah,
Facebook doesn't make money off the ads; they make money off selling the data, but they can't pay that.
Exactly, and so that's the crazy part. So, and how it differs from like Watergate and Russiagate is that Watergate, in that instance in the 70s, looks like in terms of the political scenario, it was a national disaster because politically it was one of the, like everyone knows, but even back then, like some political sins, like for instance, campaign finance laws, like every politician does that.
So let's go with the campaign finance laws. Nixon took that to a whole new level. Exactly. Nixon is the reason we have campaign finance laws in a lot of in many cases, and that came out of Watergate. That wasn't the burglary. That was one of the things that the burglary was trying to cover up, that they found out because of the tapes.
Yeah, exactly. That's the crazy part. So if you look at what I was going to say, yeah. So if you compare, like even Johnson committed horrible campaign finance laws, even the ones before. But
Johnson, a lot of Johnson's tricks were things that Nixon did, but just with less subtlety. Johnson and Nixon were both the same kind of politicians. They both had these very high ideals and these very sharp intellects. But Johnson hid his brains behind this, shucks, pick my nose. And Nixon was somebody who was very fiercely smart and in people's face. He wasn't always nice about it, but he really tried to rub his intellectual side into people's faces if he could get away with it.
I think you have to look at the difference of personality too between Nixon and Johnson. Johnson, for the better part, and well, depending on how you look at it, he always remained true to himself, like a Southern boy from Texas.
Yeah.
And he had his huge business connections. And even when he was vice president, like he hated the Kennedy's people because they were snobby, rich aristocrats.
Mm-hmm.
And there was new money. There's a difference between old money is credit card industries, oil, farming, all that type of stuff. Where these aristocratic rich families, it's all like Wall Street, all this type of stuff. And so Johnson remained to himself. Whereas and of course Johnson has some animosity towards him, but it didn't enter his politics because Johnson knew that, hey, I'm already the establishment. I own this entire thing. So
Nixon, and I'll be fair, Nixon had a really shitty childhood. His brother died. He was only able to go to college because his brother died and his parents got life insurance money. So, I mean, you think about that. You're knowing your entire life that you only got to go to college because your brother died and your parents collected life insurance money.
Yeah, we can go into Nixon even deeper too. So just to finish the point about Nixon, the reason why it was different with him is because he used this. He was always what's the word I'm looking for? He had this visceral anger and jealousy of the liberal elite. He used to say, especially about the media and how he would cover him. Because think about it, like Nixon was a political failure. On his own. Like, of course, when he was the vice president of Eisenhower, he at the time was Uncle Ike or Grandpa Ike. Many people,
Nixon was a bad cop who did all the unpopular stuff.
Exactly. And Eisenhower had to keep his military 5-star general, hero of World War II image going. And how Eisenhower even ascended the presidency.
Nixon's whole job in both of Eisenhower's political campaign was to be a hatchet man. Because Ike had to be nice and likable. Yeah,
exactly, 100%. I agree with you a lot on that. And I think what made it difficult for Nixon, too, is because, Nixon, and it's always difficult for vice presidents to win the presidency outright on their own. Yes. Like, look what happened.
He strongly believed he was cheated in
1960.
First run against JFK.
Hey, California, that was pretty fucked. That's the state that tipped the election.
Well, Nixon believed that he had been the victim of specific voting scams in Illinois and Texas, and I don't remember the other state. But basically, he was saying that Joseph Kennedy called in favors with the mayor of Chicago for Kennedy to win Illinois, and that Lyndon Johnson called in favors to stop Nixon from winning Texas.
I wouldn't doubt it, honestly. Like, that's why I said, like, when the Kennedy, and by the way, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, he fucking hated Johnson. I hated his fucking guts.
And Johnson hated him.
Oh, they hated each other. Like, it was huge beef. And I think the reason why JFK, by being the smart politician he is, he said, I don't give a shit. I want to be president. So I'm going to take the Southern Dixiecrat boy. He's going to win me Texas, which I need. And like you said, too, about his father, Joseph Kennedy, he was on the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. So it's
he was fired from the administration of FDR for being too anti-Brit, because Joseph Kennedy was made ambassador to the Court of St. James in return for his political service getting FDR elected. He was then basically fired from that position because he hated the British too much, being Irish, and he was way too friendly with Hitler's ambassador.
Ooh.
He was actually passing information about diplomatic information about the British to Hitler's ambassador at one point.
Wow, that's deep. Holy shit. That is crazy. Wow,
it's really important to understand that up until Pearl Harbor actually happened, some of the richest people in the United States were deep in bed with Hitler's government.
And it wasn't a hidden thing. I think that's really important to understand too, is that it wasn't something that was happening behind closed doors. It was something that was out in the open. You know, the newspapers were going, Hitler's new government, maybe good, maybe great. Which one? We don't know yet. You know, that was the tone of a lot of American media.
Well, you remember how a lot of American media acted like Bolsonaro was a great thing for the world down in Brazil? That was how they were about Hitler too, for a lot of the same reasons. They thought Hitler was going to be good for American business.
The same media that was saying, don't trust Donald Trump, he's a big mean bully, was putting pieces out 2 weeks later going, is Bolsonaro's strong-armed maniac thuggishness just what Brazil needs? And you're just going, this is exactly, last week you just said this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable for a politician.
Yeah, we got some more comments in the chat, actually.
Yes. Good one.
I think that's the crazy part about Trump, why he couldn't get away with stuff like this, is his biggest strength became his biggest downfall. Like when Trump was ascending. This documentary too. Did you see the?
I have not seen the documentary, but I know the story very well.
Okay, you can tell the story after I finish this one part about Trump. But the thing about Trump is that his biggest strength became his biggest downfall, and he fell on his own sword. So like in 2015, when he ran for president, this firebrand, say whatever the fuck comes out of his mouth, people wanted that because at the time they felt, okay, Obama, he's calm, collected, establishment. He never says anything off the script, and Trump is just purely off the script and says anything he wants. And Trump was smart enough to realize, okay, if people in the crowd like this shit, I might as well keep saying it, and I get more support. Like that's why Trump pretended to be anti-war and say, I'll just expand Medicare or whatever and give everyone health care, all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And how this connects with this person's comment is that in Georgia, when it was pretty tough, and by the way, in 2016 and 2020, in terms of the swing states to win the presidency, the electoral count is a landslide. But in terms of the votes in each individual state, it's been incredibly close, very narrow. So Trump, by being dumb as fuck, literally, and just calling people in Georgia, when he literally could just, I don't know, fly them out to the White House or whatever, and essentially keep it in the wraps, instead of going on Twitter and telling his entire master plan. Like that's literally what he does. I'm going to screw you at this time, at this date on Twitter. A guy like Joe Biden, you wouldn't even know about it. So that's kind of why he failed. And you had something you said something you wanted to say about the Nixon Elvis documentary.
Yeah, I haven't seen the documentary, but I know the story is Elvis, it's important to understand that at this time in his life, Elvis was doing drugs like he was a kid at Halloween with candy. And he was literally high all the time. But he visited Nixon because Nixon was a huge Elvis Presley fan. He was the right age, remember. Nixon, a huge Elvis Presley fan, invited Elvis to the White House and gave one of the biggest celebrity drug addicts in the country, not just any cop badge, a DEA badge. So Elvis was made a DEA agent by Richard Nixon while high on coke.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And it's just, I haven't seen the documentary, but I bet it's good, and now I want to find it.
I think you mentioned earlier too about one of the, because you said you compared Putin to
Poppy Bush.
Poppy Bush. I do want to talk about Poppy Bush because that's very interesting. Like, so
now I will say one thing before you start, because this is tied into what we were saying before. One of the businessmen who just loved doing business with Hitler was Prescott Bush, Grand Poppy Bush.
Right.
FDR literally had to say, my attorney general is going to prosecute you if you don't stop doing business with Krupp, because we're actually at war with Germany now, you asshole. And that was what it took for Prescott Bush to be personally threatened with prosecution by the president.
Yeah, Prescott Bush was also a United States senator too. That's
that
the crazy
came later,
part.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, and the thing about like George H.W. Bush is that, and so there's a documentary on CNN if you want to shoot yourself and, and watch it. But it's like this really stupid like fawning of like the Bushes, because apparently Trump is so terrible compared to the Bush family, even though the Bush crime family is one of the worst political families tied with the Clintons in American history. Like,
yeah.
So the thing about like George H.W. Bush is like,
don't forget the Kennedys though, since we did mention them.
Oh yeah, the Kennedys, the Kennedy family. Oh, all of them, all the Kennedys. I mean, it took 100 plus years to defeat a Kennedy.
And and I gotta say, Bobby Kennedy, when he ran for president in '68 and got shot, was actually running slightly to the left of Bernie Sanders in 1968. And it wasn't until 2016 that someone actually ran on that Bobby Kennedy platform again.
And what was that?
It was the idea that, people should have health care and people should have housing, and maybe we shouldn't give Israel so much money. Which is, the last part is most hilarious, because Bobby Kennedy was assassinated by a Palestinian when he was like the only president to ever say, the only presidential candidate at the time to ever say, we're giving Israel way too much money. That's one of the reasons there are conspiracy theories. Because why would a Palestinian choose to shoot that presidential candidate?
That's a lot. I mean, people still talk about the Kennedy assassination, how that's a big conspiracy theory too. Like, like did the person, I forgot who was the guy that actually shot Kennedy? Who was the guy
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah, was it Lee Harvey Oswald? Was it Ruby?
Oswald shot Kennedy. Ruby shot Oswald.
Yeah. So I mean, the Kennedy assassination, that's something that people still talk about as well. And it took us 100 years to defeat a Kennedy politically. Like, what's his name?
Joe Jr.
Joe Jr. So
Bobby's grandson.
Right. And so Joe Jr., he ran against Ed Markey, and Ed Markey, being a smarter politician, realized, hey, I'm at 50%. I'm roughly tied with every generation except for Gen Z and millennials. And so Ed Markey pandered his ass off. Like, all it took for him really was to take pictures with AOC licking ice cream.
Well, it was more than that.
And also, too, because of the Green New Deal and some other progressive policies. So that helped as well.
Also, there was one other thing about it, too. And, I don't know whether it's good or bad at the time. You can say either way. But leftists, anybody who was leaning politically left, was not going to let the Republicans knock Ed Markey out of the Senate right after Bernie Sanders lost the primary. I mean, it's like, we may not be able to get Bernie over the top, but we can at least save Ed Markey, damn it. And a lot of people seriously thought like that at the time.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, I think Ed Markey saw the value in what, appealing to the more left activist crowd brings, which is that, we canvass and shit. That's something.
It's not a secret. Even most of the Bloomberg people were like Bernie supporters and crap like that, because leftists are the only people willing to do legwork for the Democratic Party. So when they're trying to bully people to vote for them, it's because those are the only people they can get to do work for them, because most Democrats don't care enough.
I agree with you. And I mean, even Ed Markey himself, he has somewhat of a progressive past back in the 1970s when he was a young senator.
He was very strong on nuclear energy for a long time. He was the anti-nuke guy in DC in Congress.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was referencing. I've seen some videos, and like his campaign ad, which I say had to be the most brilliant. Whoever made the video over his campaign team, that's how you fucking run a campaign ad. Like he took the video of him when he first ran back in, I believe, 1970, of when the bosses threw his desk and chair in the Senate hallway, and he took the same words and video from back then, put it in the same words, then used JFK's words of "Let's not ask what your country could do for you.
Yes.
Ask what you can do for your country." Flipped it on its head, and then put that in the video. I was like, that's fucking brilliant, because that talks about what people say. It's like people put all this work in for this country, but it seems like your country is not helping you.
And he was absolutely right in that ad too. I mean, it may have been pandering, but he was absolutely right. And the fact that Biden isn't following through on that promise is going to very likely curse us to, a Republican Congress in 2022 and a Republican president in 2024 who's going to be maybe Trump again. Though currently in the polling, obviously it's way too early to matter, but currently Ron DeSantis is actually ahead of Trump in the Republican polling.
I can believe that. And the reason why is because Ron DeSantis is the perfect mixture of establishment and Trumper.
Mm-hmm.
Just enough establishment, it means that shut the fuck up, pretend, and just enough Trump, enough where Trump voters feel like, okay, he's a politician, but he's my politician. It's not like it's an other Republican where it's like, fuck that asshole primary him.
Mm-hmm. Also, and you can't underestimate this part, because of corrupt favors between the most pro-Trump governor in the country and the Trump White House, despite all his lack of restrictions, Florida actually received more PPE and more ventilators than any other state in the country. And as a result, outbreaks aside, people who wanted to be protected in Florida were better protected in Florida than in some other parts of the country because they had the right masks. And Florida hospitals had the right ventilators. And I know people who think, because of stuff like that Ron DeSantis did a better job as governor of Florida during the COVID thing than Andrew Cuomo did as governor of New York. And when you go back and look at the numbers, and especially the kill grandpa order, they almost have a point. I only say almost, because he also let all sorts of outbreaks happen by not having decent restrictions.
Exactly. Like he played the culture war game, I think what you're getting at is factual, not to interrupt you, because what you're saying is that Ron DeSantis played really politics well in the instance where he's greasing the palms of Trump, and the only way you can get something out of Trump is by playing to his ego. So by Ron DeSantis being deep in his pocket, he knows Donald Trump is going to return the favor and give him all the supplies. While as a guy like Andrew Cuomo, who writes a book about leadership and being the liberals' hero and adversary against Trump, Trump's like, well, fuck you. I'm going to give you the bare minimum.
Yeah, and on top of that, Cuomo had the stupidity to write that kill grandpa order.
I think we got breaking news in the chat.
Okay. Did Adams, are we saying Adams is winning?
He's the likely, yeah. I was looking at the polling. He's extreme.
He says he won't win. So Eric Adams, the cop in chief, is winning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yang has said Yang has basically conceded. He's admitting he's losing. He's not going to do better than second or third, no matter what.
Eric Adams, congratulations on being the mayor of New Jersey. I mean, wait, where do you live? Hold on.
That's a good question. Lots of people think he lives in New Jersey, but no one knows where he lives for sure because he's not telling anybody.
I mean, did you watch the thing or look at any of that stuff about his supposed house in New York? That is definitely not his son's house.
I heard I've had several people tell me about it.
Oh my gosh, it's amazing. It's it's the shallowest conspiracy ever is the thing, because it's really obvious that this is the case. His son lives there, not Eric Adams.
While no one has been able to prove his residence in New Jersey, he has basically been caught several times driving into New York State to get into New York City to get to his supposed house on the New Jersey Turnpike coming from New Jersey. That's a sign.
And I mean, it's not even, he doesn't even deny that he spends part of his time living there. It's just a question of how much.
Yeah.
Is really what it all comes down to. It's just,
and where
it's so
this home
funny.
is being hidden.
Yeah, it's also funny.
I think what's funny too is that all the cucks, especially some on the left who endorsed Andrew Yang and supported him because they all felt he was the best available. Like, how dumb do you look now? You look really dumb.
I mean, well,
like I see a lot of
this actually reminds me of what I wanted to say about Yang earlier. And before I forget, I'm going to squeeze this one out, which is that the people are showing themselves about Yang because I could see someone being a little bit deluded about Yang during the presidential primary. You know, I mean, he was out there saying, I want to give people money and stuff. That sounds pretty good, right? Like, but he has since walked back everything that was ever even remotely good about himself and just turned into this absolute nightmare candidate. So, and the people that are still pretending that supporting him is somehow progressive kind of scare me now.
Well, so keep in mind, and I don't mean this I'm not trying to speak badly of Ron, but one of our former guests on this show went all in for Yang. And he went all in for Yang because he convinced Yang to upgrade his Nordic model decriminalization of sex work to full decriminalization. And he believed that because he convinced Yang on that issue, he would be able to convince Yang on other issues. But Yang, whether or not that was true and whether or not he could convince Yang on other issues, Yang's rhetoric blew it for him. It's like everybody said, every time he opens his mouth, he gets less attractive to voters.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Andrew Yang really has he's been spending too much time with Biden. way too much time with Biden. Because he almost sounds like him a lot of times when he talks about these different issues. Like when his own people who are Asians, like we just covered this earlier today about the white supremacist dog whistles.
Yeah.
Like it's just fucking ridiculous. Like, and also
because he wants more cops to protect the Asian community when the people who they're most in danger from are cops.
And also too, his stance on BDS, which is completely shitty. Like bottom of the fucking barrel. Like he went on Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty's show.
Great minds think alike. Yang will become the next ambassador to Israel.
I swear.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's yeah. So I'm happy that Andrew Yang tanked. Well, at the same time, my thing is, I want to know how many leftish people voted for Yang, because if it's evident that even the shit libs didn't like him, so how would that affect Wiley or Morales or Stringer?
Well, Wiley ended up in second place because, for a while at least, because of Yang's tank and AOC's endorsement of her after Stringer's tank. Jamal Bowman, I think, switched to Wiley too, after initially having endorsed Stringer and then backing off when Stringer's Me Too problems came out. And I said to somebody else on Twitter earlier that, Yang is Bloomberg and Eric Adams is Giuliani.
Yeah. And
if either one of them wins, as hard as it is to believe, people are going to go, damn, I really miss Bill de Blasio.
Yeah.
Think, when you consider how progressive de Blasio ran, and how progressive his rhetoric was in his runs for mayor, and how progressive he tried to talk in his run for president, despite his record as mayor, and what his actual record as mayor ended up being. De Blasio is one of the biggest disappointments in American politics. And yet people are going to be nostalgic for him because Eric Adams is going to be so bad if he actually wins.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny that in New York State, like the mayors are always shitty, but the governors have always the best chance of being president. I think we have like 7 presidents that were New York governors, right? Like I think it's like 5 to 7. Like I know Theodore Roosevelt was the governor.
Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin.
Franklin Roosevelt. I forgot some other ones too.
There are some others too, but those are the 2 big ones.
We got another comment.
Yeah, we should talk a little about the ranked choice voting, maybe.
Especially since Tom Watson showed his ass on that.
That was the funniest.
It was. I literally replied, and I have to check to see if it's still the top reply, but I literally replied. It's like picking your 5 favorite movies, Tom.
Yeah, the funny thing is we live in this time of standardized testing. RJ, I don't know exactly how old you are, but I'm guessing that your school experience was a lot like mine, with just standardized tests shoved down your throat every single year. If we could learn to do that, then we can figure out ranked choice voting. I promise.
Ranked choice voting is easier than a standardized test.
Yeah, I mean, the ranked choice voting part is interesting because you can pick up the 5 candidates in the New York City mayor race, and I believe I think Bree Joy had Andrew Yang as her 5th pick, and then you can pick. I don't know what her first pick was, but I think
what matters is that in the general election, if you live in New York, there is a Party of Socialism and Liberation candidate running. Vote for the communists. That's your best choice now.
Why do you think New York has a hard time getting any decent mayors? It seems like everyone has been kind of shitty. As like Bloomberg, Giuliani.
What is New York? Is
you have to understand. You have to understand that the position of New York mayor is much like the Hamburglar in that it was created purely to absorb public scorn. That's the point.
The job of the mayor of New York City for a long time now, it's true, has been to be hated by the people who live in New York City so that they don't hate the capitalists behind him. Because the mayor of New York's job is really to run interference for Wall Street and the richest and most disgusting people in the country while they rob us. And more importantly, while landlords rob the heck out of the city of New York. And you know, even the tiny bit that Bill de Blasio did, like, you know, making stop and frisk less odiously all over the place, and minor reforms, that was like a huge deal. And as disappointing as de Blasio was to so many people, I mean, usually the police haven't needed to go so far as to threaten the mayor's daughter to get him to do what they want. If you all remember that.
I did not remember that.
So Bill de Blasio's daughter was arrested by the cops at a George Floyd protest in New York City.
And they basically just got on Twitter and were like, "We have your daughter."
Yeah. Yeah. They were like the bad guys in Man on Fire.
So, also was weird too is the dynamic between Daddy Cuomo and de Blasio during that time. Liberals like to think of Cuomo as their super cool and that, the Cuomo sexuals.
De Blasio and Andrew Cuomo hate each other more than Andrew Cuomo hates Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton.
True.
Which is saying a lot. As Andrew Cuomo has had a grudge against the Clintons ever since he lost a Senate race to Hillary, despite having been in Bill's cabinet.
Whoa, hold on. I did not know this. This is new information. So
When
you're
Hillary
saying,
ran for Senate, Andrew Cuomo lost to her in the primary.
by how much? Was it a landslide or was it like a squeaking it out?
It was, I mean, you got to remember that we're talking about Andrew Cuomo and Hillary Clinton. These are not the two most beloved people. So it was kind of close.
Ooh.
It was like, and I was actually rooting for Andrew Cuomo at the time because I thought, well, you know,
Like
Mario
Mario.
was okay.
Those
Andrew's
two-
got to be better than Hillary.
Those two running against each other is definitely a "don't blame me, I voted for Kodos" situation. If anyone remembers that Simpsons episode where the two evil aliens run against each other.
The Hillary versus Andrew Cuomo more than anything else justifies the Cthulhu 2024 vote for the greater evil.
Oh, don't put that image in my head of Hillary coming back and Andrew Cuomo in 2024. And that
Andrew Cuomo versus Hillary Clinton. It's like, yeah, I would vote for Cthulhu in that election.
But also think about it too, like that's all contingent on how bad Kamala tanks as vice president, like that. And by the way, she doesn't have the best start because.
And this is fair.
Yes, there's a lot
Let's
of people.
talk about New York and primary voting. This is one of the things the Republicans have told the truth about. A lot of people in New York don't even vote in primaries and love the police or have been manipulated into thinking that they're looking out for the community, or at least a lot of the people who vote do. So basically, the only people, and this is true too, because rich liberals in New York are the people who make decisions for the New York Democratic Party. But the thing to remember about New York, especially New York City, but New York State in general, is the Democratic primaries are set up to only let the people that the party wants to vote. The ranked choice thing was a huge deal, but they didn't really do anything to increase turnout other than the ranked choice voting, which meant more people braved all the obstacles. But a lot of votes were still suppressed because of the way the New York system works. New York literally has a system designed that only the people the New York State Democratic Party wants to vote can vote in a Democratic Party, or Democratic primary. And the general election isn't much different. The early voting restrictions in New York are tougher than the early voting restrictions in states like Texas and Georgia, which are renowned for voter suppression. But Democrats don't talk about it, and the media doesn't talk about it. Chicago has reputations for the most corrupt Democratic Party politics in the country. Lori Lightfoot's whole thing was, you can trust me because I was in the Obama cabinet. I was in the Obama administration, and I never had anything to do with any of this corrupt city of Chicago politics. And look how that turned out.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago is corrupt as fuck too because you got people. What's his name? Rahm Emanuel. Then you got Lori Lightfoot.
Emanuel, yes.
Oh,
And let's not forget that not only Rod Blagojevich, the guy Trump pardoned, but also his predecessor, George Ryan, both went directly from the governor's office to prison. They call it the Illinois State Gubernatorial Retirement Plan. And so when we're talking, so yeah, I mean, it's these northern blue states are as bad as the red states, and people don't talk about it.
Yeah, because when you have one party controlling the entire city.
The guy before Blagojevich was a Republican, but I mean, Illinois was still controlled by Democrats except for the governor. He could only do so much. And when he wanted, the only thing I can say that's good is when he realized he was going to go to prison, the last thing he did as governor was put a moratorium on the death penalty in order to look like he was doing something good. because that was when there was a court case that was before the Supreme Court to decide whether it was going to be constitutional or not again. So he put a moratorium on the death penalty, saying, yeah, no more death penalties are going to be given out in this state until the Supreme Court reaches a decision or decides to throw the case up. And that was just basically to try to get less prison time and to get good press before he went to prison, so people would remember him for something good.
Yeah, it's almost like what billionaires do by giving money to all these foundations, like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers did, and then die and say, "Oh, see, look how great I did at the end of my life." It's like you did an entire lifetime of scamming and robbing working class people and poor people, yet you decide to do a Carnegie Hall within the last 20 years of you living. We're supposed to forgive you of all your sins. So,
and that's really, and what's more than that, it's worse, because a lot of that philanthropy and those foundations are also like sinecures for their kids,
like the Clinton Foundation, the Trump Foundation,
the Trump Foundation. The Clinton Foundation is a good example, though. Since setting up this huge charitable operation, have the Clintons gotten poorer or richer?
Definitely richer.
Bill Gates has gotten richer since deciding he was going to give all his money away.
Yeah, he said he was giving it away. He had too much money. He had to give it all away, and then somehow he's richer still.
Yes. And Steve Jobs' widow, along with her business partners, Arnie Duncan, who helped Obama ruin the reputation of union teachers in this country, and Michael Klein, who used to run the Saudi royal family's finances in the United States, own Axios and The Atlantic. So that's two big, huge news conglomerates that people don't always talk about being owned by really wealthy people, being owned by really wealthy people. And on that note, I see that we have gone a little over 2 hours tonight, which has been fun. This is a really great show, but I will ask at this point, does anybody have any final thoughts? RJ?
No, I don't have any final thoughts. I think this was fun. I love how we went down the rabbit hole a lot.
I go down rabbit hole. I love talking about history and how history ties into stuff that's happening now. I really don't believe anything is new. When people talk about Trump, you could go back and find precedents for almost everything Trump allegedly did that people in the media acted like it never happened before. And what's more, when those things became public, stuff was done about it. A member of the Warren G. Harding cabinet went to federal prison for selling a mountain in Wyoming to an oil company.
What? That is
Teapot
crazy.
Dome scandal.
How do you sell a mountain?
So you remember how Trump basically denational parked Obama's national parks?
Right.
So this mountain, Teapot Dome, was in or near Yellowstone, which had been made a national park by
Teddy Roosevelt.
And they basically sold the mountain to an oil company. Now the government took it back after all the scandal and stuff because it was such a big deal. But it was now keep in mind that nowadays, both W and Obama opened up federal land in Alaska for oil exploration, and there was no scandal at all. It was a lot of news about why they shouldn't do it. But, there was no scandal about it. Nobody said they're selling Alaska to the oil companies. And so it's interesting. But Trump, Trump reversing national parks to let his corrupt interior secretary sell oil exploration and mineral exploration rights to corporations. It's the same thing Hardy did on a bigger scale.
Yeah, maybe Trump thought, hey, if I open up hotels near the Grand Canyon, I'll be...
He would have tried it if he had gotten a chance. I mean, remember...
of course he would have.
But it's also important.
He was scheming on some federal lands.
So
someday I want to talk about this more, actually, because I want to talk about some of the schemes that Trump tried to pull off in office that didn't work. Because I feel like those are going to get forgotten really
Greenland!
Buying Greenland!
Greenland!
That was the most amazing thing anyone has ever proposed in politics in all of history. Come on.
And the funny part is he doesn't understand that Greenland is the place where it's like icy as shit.
Well, that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
The ice in Greenland is melting. There's going to be big real estate opportunities in Greenland as global warming destroys other parts of the world.
I'm getting ready to move there. I heard BlackRock's not buying houses there yet.
Well, that's the thing. Is Trump wanted to buy Greenland so that there was some place rich people could go to hide from climate crisis, basically.
Is it because of the elevation or what?
Well, it's so far north.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Greenland is, I mean, remember when Perry and his friends, Perry and Henson, were looking for the North Pole. Greenland was where they were doing it because they went overland from Greenland till they got to the glaciers and then walked over the ice to the North Pole, or claimed to. There's now a great many questions about whether or not they ever actually got there. But at the time, they claimed that they got to the North Pole. Apparently what they really did was have a whole lot of illegitimate children with indigenous people. And one of the interesting facts is there are a large number of Black indigenous Greenlanders who are descended from Matthew Henson. And a large number of indigenous and a slightly larger number of indigenous Greenlanders who are descended from Perry.
That's interesting there.
Yeah. Our current level of wealth inequality surpasses that of revolutionary France, but this is America.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Now, keep in mind that in revolutionary France, the sans-culottes were literally having rich people's heads chopped off if they looked at them wrong. So yeah, it's a big difference. And that's a good final thought, actually. I think that is the perfect place for us to end the show. In revolutionary France, the poorest people were getting the head chopped off rich people who looked at them wrong for far lower levels of wealth inequality, which is scary because it was pretty unequal in revolutionary France.
Yep.
And on that note, I want to wish everybody who stuck it out a great night. I want to thank you all. I want to thank Colleen for showing up. I want to thank Dylan and Quaker Socialist for being so active in the chat. We appreciate it. And I hope everybody has a great night.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
I'll tweet at you, folks.
And thank you, RJ, for joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I had a blast. It was great discussing a whole lot.